What if I told you the US government has spent a century quietly erasing evidence of giants? That's the claim. Newspapers reported it for decades. 9, 10, 11-foot human skeletons, dug out of ancient mounds, beneath state capitals, then vanished without a trace. The claim is everywhere online. The evidence behind it is almost non-existent. So what actually happened to those bones? The land before the capitals. Long before marble domes and legislative chambers, much of the American Midwest and South was covered in earthen mounds. Thousands of them were built by indigenous cultures like the Adena, Hopewell, and Mississippian peoples over a span of nearly 3,000 years. Many state capitals were founded directly on or near these mound sites because the mounds sat on high, fertile, defensible ground. Those were the exact same qualities that made the spots attractive to 19th century city planners. Circleville, Ohio, was literally laid out in circles around a mound. Moundsville, West Virginia, is named for one. This isn't legend, it's documented urban planning history, and it's the real foundation the giant story was built on top of. The first giant headlines, starting in the 1870s and picking up speed through the 1890s, small town and regional newspapers across the Midwest and South ran a steady stream of sensational stories about mound excavations turning up skeletons of enormous size. The claims followed a strikingly consistent format: a location, a measurement, a burial context, and almost never a surviving specimen anyone could actually go check. Take Brewersville, Indiana, in 1879. Local reports described a skeleton 9 feet, 8 inches tall, pulled from a mound with a mica necklace still around its neck. The bones were reportedly stored in a grain mill, and conveniently, they washed away in a flood decades later in 1937, long before modern measurement techniques could ever verify them. In Warren, Minnesota, the St. Paul Pioneer Press reported on May 23, 1883, that 10 skeletons of both sexes and of gigantic size had been pulled from a single mound. Near Zanesville, Ohio, the journal American Antiquarian described in 1880 a skeleton of enormous dimensions found inside a clay coffin, alongside a sandstone slab, bearing mysterious hieroglyphics, a detail that shows up again and again in these reports, always described, never photographed in any verifiable way. By the 1890s, the stories had spread nationwide and gotten even more elaborate. The Chicago Record reported on October 24, 1895, that a mound near Toledo, Ohio, held 20 skeletons seated in a circle, facing east, with jaws and teeth twice as large as those of present-day people. Just weeks earlier, on January 3, 1895, the Portsmouth, Ohio News Herald reported that railroad workers had uncovered a skeleton measuring 7 feet, 4 inches, while excavating for a bridge. Even the New York Times got in on it, reporting on July 5, 1891, that a skeleton believed to belong to a man over 6 feet, 5 inches tall, had been unearthed at a Massachusetts estate, headlined, memorably, Mr. Jefferson's Cyclops. Not every one of these claims went unchallenged at the time. In 1883, the Indianapolis Journal reported a 9-foot skeleton found in Indiana. A local physician, Dr. M. M. Adams, actually investigated the find and concluded the bones belonged to someone no taller than 5'8". He called it, in his own words, a giant fraud on the public. And the Zanesville hieroglyph slab wasn't just unverifiable, it was eventually exposed outright. A worker from the excavation crew later testified in court that he'd been paid $15 to carve the ancient hieroglyphics himself, and another crew member admitted the skeletons had been too crumbled to measure with any accuracy. Ohio State archaeologist Brad Lepper, writing in the Columbus Dispatch in December 2020, drew on decades of clippings collected by archaeologist Donald Ball, some dating as far back as 1845, and found the same pattern again and again: a dramatic headline, a suspiciously round measurement, vague sourcing, and no verifiable scientific follow-up. Local reporters in this era weren't scientists, and outlets were competing hard for readers in the golden age of sensationalist yellow journalism. A skull found at an unusual angle, a leg bone a few inches longer than expected, or honestly just a good story that sold papers in Indiana, Ohio, Iowa, and Missouri alike, was often all it took to turn a routine mound dig into a front-page sensation, one that, more often than not, vanished from the record almost as quickly as it appeared, and on the rare occasions someone did check, as with Adams and the Zanesville slab, it fell apart on contact. Why the bones looked giant. Alois Hrdlicka wasn't a casual skeptic. He was the Smithsonian's own curator of physical anthropology, and he spent decades tracking these claims before publishing his findings in 1934. His conclusion, summarized that year in outlets like the Oshkosh Northwestern, under the headline, "Human Giants, of Past Not Proved, usually by Bones," rejected the idea of any prehistoric race standing 7 to 8 feet tall. And crucially, his argument wasn't a cover-up story. It went the opposite direction, laying out exactly why the evidence kept falling apart. Hrdlicka pointed to 3 recurring causes. First, amateur excavators, unfamiliar with human anatomy, routinely misjudged bone length, especially the femur, the single bone most responsible for exaggerated height estimates. Second, bones from extinct Ice Age megafauna, mastodons, and other large mammals whose remains were common in the same soil layers were sometimes mistaken for oversized human bones. Third, and most simply, he pointed to what he called the will to believe, a public appetite for wonder that made isolated, poorly measured fragments feel like proof of giants. He noted that fresh giant skeleton claims crossed his desk 2 to 3 times a month, and almost none survived proper measurement by a trained anatomist. A story with a dark undercurrent. In the 19th century, many white settlers refused to believe Native American nations were sophisticated enough to have built the mounds. Instead, a popular theory emerged that a vanished lost race, sometimes described as giants, sometimes as an ancient white civilization, had built them, and native peoples had merely moved in afterward. Historians now recognize this as the mound builder myth, and it served a convenient political purpose. It helped justify displacement because it painted indigenous nations as unrelated to and lesser than whoever really built these monuments. The Smithsonian's own 1894 report by ethnologist Cyrus Thomas, based on years of fieldwork, was actually what shut this myth down in scientific circles, proving conclusively that the mounds were built by the ancestors of Native American nations. Enter the cover-up theory. If the mounds were built by ordinary humans, why do giant skeleton stories still spread today? Much of the modern version traces back to a single article, published on December 3, 2014, by World News Daily Report, a website that openly labels itself satire in its own disclaimers. The article, titled "Smithsonian Admits to Destruction of Thousands of Giant Human Skeletons in Early 1900s," claimed a U.S. Supreme Court ruling had forced the Smithsonian to release classified documents proving it destroyed tens of thousands of giant skeletons, some reportedly measuring between 6 and 12 feet tall, with declassification supposedly set for 2015. Reuters, the Associated Press, and Snopes all investigated independently and found no such Supreme Court case existed, no classified files existed, and the American Institution of Alternative Archaeology, quoted as the source of the whistleblower claims, appears nowhere in any record except citations of this same article. A Smithsonian spokesperson directly denied the story. The photo evidence collapsed just as fast. One image endlessly recirculated as proof: men standing in an excavation pit beside a giant, half-buried skeleton, traces back to a doctored composite, not an actual dig site. Fact-checkers found the skeleton itself had been digitally inserted into an unrelated excavation photo. A second image commonly attached to these claims turned out to depict Edouard Beaupré, a real French-Canadian man who stood roughly 8 feet tall, due to a documented medical condition called gigantism. Beaupre worked as a sideshow performer and wrestler in the early 1900s before dying in 1904 at just 23 years old, a well-known public figure in his own time, not a secret, and certainly nothing the Smithsonian ever classified. National Geographic has been publicly correcting this specific hoax since at least 2002, tracing its spread to the doctored photo's unintended religious undertones, which gave it a built-in, receptive online audience for over a decade. The grain of truth inside the myth. To be fair to the theory's popularity, it isn't built on nothing. Starting in the 19th century, the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology actively encouraged local excavators, amateur antiquarians, and even farmers who stumbled onto mounds to ship remains directly to Washington for study. This wasn't secretive, it was official policy, part of building a national research collection. Over time, this process gathered more than 18,000 sets of human remains, most taken from Native American burial sites, into Smithsonian custody. That practice only ended in 1990, when Congress passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, legally requiring institutions to identify and return remains and sacred objects to descendant tribal nations. So bones genuinely were sent away, and many genuinely were never publicly displayed again, not because they were destroyed, but because they were cataloged, stored, studied over decades, and eventually entered a slow, ongoing repatriation process. Researchers like Jim Vieira, featured on the show Search for the Lost Giants, and author Richard Dewhurst, who wrote The Ancient Giants Who Ruled America, point to this same pattern of remains vanishing from public view as evidence of suppression. Mainstream historians read the identical paper trail as something else entirely, ordinary, if ethically troubled, 19th and 20th century museum practice. Why state capitals specifically? So why do these stories keep circling back to Capitol buildings? Partly because the underlying geography is real. Nashville, chosen as Tennessee's permanent capital in 1843, sits in the heart of the Middle Cumberland Basin, a region once dense with Mississippian-era platform mounds and stone box burial grounds, including over 6,000 burials documented near Browns Creek alone before urban development destroyed them. Columbus, Ohio, and nearby Circleville were built directly within a landscape shaped by Adena and Hopewell earthworks, with Circleville's original street grid literally following the shape of a mound complex. Indianapolis and other Midwestern capitals developed along the same river corridors. Mound-building cultures had settled centuries earlier for identical reasons: high ground, fresh water, fertile soil. And partly, the story sticks because giants buried under the seat of government is simply a more compelling image than giants buried under a cornfield. The theory borrows this real geography and genuine archaeological history, then layers a modern suspicion of institutions on top of it. The idea that government wouldn't just study inconvenient history, it would bury it. That instinct, distrust of official record keepers, is what keeps the story alive more than any single piece of evidence does. What actual archaeology has found. Set the giants aside, and the real story underneath America's mounds is arguably even more impressive. Serpent Mound in Ohio remains one of North America's most remarkable earthworks. Its exact age is still debated, with different studies placing its construction anywhere from the late woodland period to around AD 1070. Regardless of the date, the serpent's winding form is carefully aligned with the summer solstice sunset, reflecting sophisticated astronomical knowledge and careful planning rather than myth. Cahokia, near modern St. Louis, is the standout example. At its peak, between roughly AD 1050 and 1200, it held an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 residents, spread across about 6 square miles containing at least 120 earthworks, making it larger than London at the same time. Its centerpiece, Monk's Mound, stands about 100 feet tall and covers roughly 14 acres at its base, giving it a base area comparable to the Great Pyramid of Giza, built entirely by hand with woven baskets. Nearby, a massive circle of cedar posts, known as Woodhenge, functioned as a solar calendar, marking the solstices and equinoxes with remarkable precision. Trade goods recovered there, including copper from the Great Lakes and shells from the Gulf Coast, show that Cahokia was connected to a continent-spanning trade network. Ironically, the Giants myth has spent more than a century distracting from this genuinely remarkable true story. The bigger theory. This feeds into the Giants legend is one thread of a bigger online theory, Tartaria, or the mud flood. The claim is that a globally advanced civilization was buried under a catastrophic flood of mud in the 1800s, and that grand old buildings, courthouses, train stations, capitol buildings were seized from that civilization rather than built by the settlers credited with them. The theory then folds in a real historical event, the orphan trains, which relocated roughly 200,000 children across North America between 1854 and 1929, recasting them as a replacement population sent to resettle emptied cities. Renamed towns and streets get read the same way. Evidence records were scrubbed. Historians who've actually studied this, including a University of Nebraska historian and a University of Chicago professor who now uses it as a teaching example of pseudo-history, find no evidence for a mud flood, a lost empire, or any population reset. The orphan trains were a documented child welfare program. Town renaming followed mundane causes, postal confusion, political rebranding, merging townships. The architecture and the child relocation are real. The flood connecting them is invented. Separating legend from history. None of this means every giant skeleton report from 1880s newspapers was invented from thin air. Some larger than average remains, and cases of gigantism like the well-documented Edouard Beaupré likely fed the legend along the way. But the leap from some outlier remains existed to a hidden race of giants is buried under every state capital, and Washington is hiding. It is where documented history ends and folklore begins. The honest version of this story isn't a cover-up. It's a 200-year-old game of telephone, starting with sensational Victorian-era journalism, shaped by a political need to erase Indigenous achievement, and revived by a satirical article that a modern audience mistook for a leak. So are there giants buried under America's state capitals? The mounds are real. The scale of what was built on top of them is real. The giants, as far as any verified physical evidence shows, are a story, not a discovery. But it's a story that reveals something true about America anyway. How easily we'll believe in a hidden, erased civilization, while walking right past the real one still written into the ground beneath our feet. The actual archaeology of Cahokia, and why it once outsized cities like Paris. That's the next video.